On the morning of January the 15th, 1947, the dead body of a naked woman was discovered in a vacant lot in the neighborhood of Leimert Park, a neighborhood of Los Angeles, California, which nowadays is the location of a row of houses, but back in 1947 it was mostly an undeveloped area. The body was discovered by a mother who was taking her child for an early morning walk when she stumbled upon the body, which had been brutally severed in half. The bottom half of the body had been laid approximately about a foot away from the top half of her body, and her intestines had been removed and neatly folded and placed under her buttocks, and her skin was a pallid white. So white in fact that upon first inspection, the mother who was walking her child mistook the body for a mannequin. The reason for the pallid white skin was because the body had been drained of all of its blood, and the dead woman had been given a Glasgow smile. This is where the face is slashed from the corner of the mouth to the ears. Her thighs and breasts had also been slashed, and the dead woman had been posed in the following way, with her hands over her head, her elbows bent at right angles, and her legs spread apart. It wouldn't be long before the body was identified. The woman's name was Elizabeth Short, but is more widely known by a nickname, the Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short was born on July the 29th, 1924 in Medford, Massachusetts in Boston, and was the third of 5 daughters. Elizabeth's father built miniature golf courses, but her times were ahead when he lost his savings in the 1929 stock market crash, and was believed to have committed suicide when his car was found abandoned on the Charlestown Bridge. However, in 1942, Elizabeth's mother received a letter of apology from her apparently dead husband, who had actually left to start a new life in California. In December of the same year, 18-year-old Elizabeth Short set out to reconnect with her father, who she had not seen since she was 6 years old. But unfortunately, this reconnection was not to be, and she moved out in January after many arguments with her father. Now, after this, Elizabeth's life was a little bit chaotic. Elizabeth was somewhat of a drifter, and it seemed that she liked men, especially military men and men with money, and she certainly did dress to impress. It was also rumoured that she lived with an Air Force sergeant at some point, who may or may not have abused her. In 1943, she was arrested for underage drinking and was sent home by the juvenile authorities, but instead she ended up in Florida. Whilst in Florida, she met an Air Force pilot who she apparently had decided she was to marry. Unfortunately, her husband-to-be was killed in an aircraft accident, but she also claimed to have lost a baby who belonged to this man. But the relationship was later turned out to be false, as it was later discovered that Elizabeth was also writing to many other men confessing her love. It seemed like she was desperate to meet a husband, someone to maybe look after her, someone to care for her. In 1946, Elizabeth found herself in Los Angeles, working as a waitress with dreams of one day becoming an actress. Little did she know that on the 9th of January the following year, her face would be plastered in many a newspaper. Her name in black and white, under the headline, "Former Medford Girl Found Slain." Betty Berzinger was the name of the woman who was out walking her child that morning when she discovered Elizabeth's body. After Betty reported the crime, the call to investigate went over the police radio, which also went over the shortwave radio that belonged to some reporters, and they made it to the scene before the police. Upon arrival, the reporters were obviously shocked at the gruesome find of Elizabeth's body being severed in two and displayed in such a way. But they had a job to do, and they immediately started to snap the gruesome pictures of Elizabeth's severed body. That would be censored on the front page of the newspapers, and for many years to come. For example, when the very graphic photographs of Elizabeth Short's mutilated body did hit the front page, the gruesome slashes to the face were airbrushed by an artist, and also a sheet was drawn over Elizabeth's body. It was years before the public actually saw the actual photos of the dead body of Elizabeth Short that are now widely available all over the internet and in many a book. Now, like I said before, the body lay severed in half, with the face cut open from each side of her mouth up to her ears, which suggested that this was a frenzied attack, and it was most likely carried out with a knife while she was still alive. Although the cause of death was determined to have been due to hemorrhaging from the blows to the head and the cuts to her face. Her eyes were half open and her body, both halves, lay in such a way that must have been purposeful, with the legs spread and the bottom half of the body lay about a foot away from the top side of the body, and the arms were placed above her head. The way the body was displayed was almost like a macabre piece of art. Not far from the body was an empty cement bag with bloody water inside. This was definitely the bag that was used to carry the body in. The body itself had been soaked in water, and no blood was on the ground, suggesting that the murder took place elsewhere. It is thought that maybe the dismemberment of the body had been carried out in a bathtub. The police also found tyre tracks and a heel print on the ground. The very next day, the autopsy was underway and brought forward more shocking details to an already gruesome crime scene. Ligature marks were found on Elizabeth's wrist, neck and ankles, suggesting that she was tied up at some point, and she also had lacerations to her breasts, right forearm, lower left side of the chest, and knife wounds to the pubic area and upper legs. She had also had bruising to the right and left-hand side of the scalp, and her stomach was filled with feces, meaning that she was most likely forced to eat it. The way the top half of the body had been severed from the bottom half suggested that the killer had a background in surgery, as it was so cleanly and expertly done. This also suggested that the cuts inflicted to the face and the rest of the body may have been performed by someone different. Someone, like I said before, who may have inflicted these cuts upon Elizabeth in a frenzy. But the separation of the bottom half of the body from the top half of the body seemed to have been done by someone who had medical training, which would later prompt the police to interview over 300 medical students. There were also telltale signs that Elizabeth may have been raped, although tests were done looking for the presence of sperm, but none were found. But bear in mind that the body had been washed by the killer before it had been dumped. Now, at this point, after finding the body, the police had no idea who this young woman was, and after running her fingerprints, they were in luck. She was actually on file after being arrested a few years back for underage drinking. Now, Elizabeth's mother wasn't immediately contacted by the police because the media got there first. The newspapers got in there first and contacted the mother. But the way they did this, the way that they informed her that her daughter was dead, was in the most despicable way you could ever imagine. The Los Angeles Examiner were one of the first newspapers to try and gather as much information on Elizabeth Short as they could. And like I said, they went about it in possibly the most disrespectful, terrible way possible. They actually rang Elizabeth's mother, who at this point had no idea that her daughter was actually dead. Now, instead of informing the mother that her daughter was dead, they instead told her that Elizabeth had won a beauty competition, and they actually asked the proud mother to provide them with as much information as she could on her own daughter. And then when they decided they had as much information as they could get out of her, it was only then that they informed this poor woman that her daughter was in fact dead. That her daughter had been brutally murdered in the worst possible way you could ever imagine. Now, after Elizabeth's mother was informed that her daughter was dead, the Los Angeles Examiner offered to fly her over to identify the body. However, this was not done out of kindness. This was done to ensure that Elizabeth's mother was in the pocket of the newspaper, so that if there was a story to be had from her mother, they would have it first. There was no kindness whatsoever, it was purely business. Now, nowadays we know that the murder is referred to as the Black Dahlia murders, but it wasn't always this way. Initially the papers were referring to the crime as the werewolf murders, and this obviously did not stick, and a few days later the papers started using the nickname the Black Dahlia. Now, the name was actually a play on words from the 1946 movie called The Blue Dahlia, and the nickname the Black Dahlia was actually given to Elizabeth by friends because of her long black hair and stunning looks. And may I add, by pure coincidence, the plot of that movie actually revolved around the murder of a woman. Now, finding any kind of lead on the murder was proving difficult. There were many people actually calling the police claiming that they did kill Elizabeth. But these were just false confessions, and there were so many of them. People who just wanted to be in the limelight for 5 minutes. They would confess to the murder, even though they had nothing at all to do with it. And I actually believe that the police referred to these kind of people who did this as confessing Sams. It was kind of like a slang term used by the police at the time. And obviously these false confessions by these confessing Sams were actually hindering the investigation somewhat. But on January the 21st, a phone call was received by the editor of the Examiner from someone claiming to be the killer. The person on the phone claimed that they were prepared to turn themselves in, but not just yet, and that the Examiner should look out for a parcel that will be delivered very, very soon, arriving in the post. 3 days later, the Examiner received a manila envelope, and inside was the following: Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the front cover. No clues or fingerprints had been found on the envelope, as it had been wiped with gasoline by whoever had sent it. And on that very same day, a handbag and a blue suede shoe that belonged to Elizabeth was found on a garbage can in an alleyway a few miles away from the crime scene, and once again, both had been wiped with gasoline. On March the 14th, a suicide note was found inside a man's shoe that lay with a pile of clothing by the ocean. The note claimed to be from the killer, who had decided to commit suicide rather than turn himself in. Whoever wrote that note and left the clothing remains a mystery. The case to this day is still shrouded in mystery and remains unsolved, although there are plenty of suspects. On December the 9th, 1946, the year before Elizabeth was found murdered, Dorothy French was closing up the Aztec Theatre after the last showing, only to discover a woman asleep in the front row. It was Elizabeth, and she told Dorothy that she had nowhere to sleep and had no money. Dorothy took pity and allowed Elizabeth to come home and stay with herself and her mother, while she tried to find work and a place to stay. Elizabeth's stay with the Frenches was only supposed to be for a day or two, but days turned into weeks. And even though Elizabeth assured the Frenches that she was in fact looking for work, it would seem that all she was interested in was going out and dating men, and sleeping all day on the French's couch, whilst her clothing was thrown all over the living room, and the pungent smell of perfume lingered in the air. And Dorothy and her mother would find themselves tiptoeing around their own house, so they wouldn't wake up Elizabeth, who was sleeping all day on the couch. And as you can imagine, things got a little bit tense in the household. And eventually, Dorothy would find herself slamming the door as she left, hoping that it would wake Elizabeth up. The Frenches also noticed that Elizabeth always seemed to be in a nervous state, as though she was hiding out in their home. This became abundantly clear one day when a man and a woman knocked on their door, whilst another man waited in the car. Elizabeth seemed to become frightened and insisted that she did not want to see them. And no one answered the door. Instead, they waited for the mysterious visitors to get back in the car and drive away. After this, Elizabeth became frightened and refused to talk about the people at the door, and 2 days later, she left with a mystery man who the Frenches only knew as Red. Now, the man known as Red was named Robert Manley. He was a married salesman and had recently become a father to a baby boy, and he was suspect number one in the killing of Elizabeth Short, because in her last days he was seen with her quite a lot, driving her from location to location, and maybe a little bit more. You see, Manley had been dating Elizabeth despite being married and being the father of a newborn baby, and on the 9th of January he drove her from San Diego to Los Angeles and left her at the Biltmore Hotel. According to Manley, on the drive to Los Angeles, Elizabeth looked worried and seemed to be checking to see if there were anyone following them. This was 1 week before her mutilated body was found. Manley was questioned and even given a polygraph test, which he passed with flying colours, and he was cleared of the murder. But he did provide confirmation that some shoes and a handbag that was recovered from the dump were in fact Elizabeth's. Now, even though Manley was cleared of the murder, it totally ruined him. His wife left him due to his infidelity, and he fell into a depression and eventually found himself in an asylum for the insane, where he committed suicide. But Manley wasn't the only suspect in the Black Dahlia case. There were plenty more. Suspects were aplenty, but unfortunately nothing really shed light on the case, especially as most of the people that came forward were actually liars, false confessions. The LAPD called these people confessing Sams, like I said before. They were mainly homeless people or drunks, down and out sorts who simply wanted a roof over their heads, and confessing to a murder was a sure way to be locked up in a nice warm building for the night. Even an army corporal turned himself in for the murder. He claimed that he was bar hopping with Elizabeth and blacked out, only to come around and have flashbacks of himself killing Elizabeth. But other witnesses proved that the corporal was in fact in New Jersey on the date that the murder took place. And the LAPD knew that most were lying, as they had certain information about the crime that only they knew about, and all of the confessing Sams had absolutely no clue. A former detective named Steve Hodel published a book in 2003 titled Black Dahlia, Avenger, The True Story, and in this book he claims that his own father, George Hodel, who was a doctor, may have killed the Black Dahlia. Steve claimed that he found photographs in his father's possessions of his father and Elizabeth. He also came to the conclusion that due to the fact that his father was a doctor and would have had the skill to separate the top end of the body from the bottom in such a way, then he may have just done the killing himself. And also Steve claimed that his father's handwriting was very similar to the letter that was sent to the newspapers by the so-called killer. And Steve also found a receipt for bags of cement, which was dated a little before Elizabeth Short's death. And if you remember, Elizabeth's body was actually carried to the crime scene in cement bags. And it was also revealed that George Holdall was actually on the suspect list, and the FBI had actually bugged his house. And apparently, they heard a woman scream at some point. Also, George Holdall had been heard saying some odd things over the phone. What I'm about to read you is the transcript from one of those conversations that George Holdall had on the phone when he was being tapped. Now, bear in mind, some of this doesn't make sense. I'm presuming that some of the recordings weren't very clear.
Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary.
Doesn't quite make sense in all the parts, but I'm guessing that the recording wasn't clear maybe, and that's why we only got little bits of the conversation. And it wasn't only George Holdall's son who believed that he could have been the killer. His daughter also believed that he could have been the killer after she accused him of raping her way back in 1949. But, like most of the suspects on this list, it still remains unproven. And let's not forget the notebook that was found in Elizabeth's belongings, which had the name Mark Hansen embossed on the front. Now, Mark Hansen was a shady nightclub owner, and apparently he had a keen interest in Elizabeth, and she had actually stayed with him for a few nights, but eventually turned him down flat. Maybe this was enough to anger him to actually go and murder Elizabeth. Maybe, but what you've got to remember is, if he did murder Elizabeth, why would he provide the police with a notebook with his name embossed on the front? It just doesn't add up. There was also a theory that Elizabeth may have become pregnant by newspaper publisher Norman Chandler, and maybe Norman Chandler looked to a gangster called Bugsy Siegel to kill her to keep it hush hush. This was a hunch by the author of the Black Dahlia Files by Donald H. Wolfe, the book that I have actually used to research this topic, and it is a very, very good book, and I do recommend you read it in full if you want to know a little bit more about the case of the Black Dahlia. And like I said before, there are so many suspects, so many theories on who the killer could be. In many ways, the Black Dahlia murders remind me a lot of the Jack the Ripper murders, which has a vast amount of amateur sleuths following the case, trying to solve the murder, that in my opinion will possibly never ever be solved. And let's not forget the conspiracy theories that maybe the police actually knew who the killer was and they were keeping it under wraps, they were keeping it secret, protecting someone maybe. The sad reality is that we may never know who the killer or killers of Elizabeth Short was, and this case may always be a mystery. The nickname the Black Dahlia was given to Elizabeth before she actually died, and it is said that the Black Dahlia symbolised Elizabeth's beauty, and that's why people named her the Black Dahlia. But after death, the Black Dahlia took on a whole new meaning, and it's quite fitting that she was named after a black flower. That simply doesn't exist. Nowadays, the black flower can symbolise sophistication and elegance, intrigue and mystery, betrayal and sadness, and of course, death. And if anything, being given the name the Black Dahlia actually foreshadowed the tragedy that was in store for Elizabeth Short. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you all very, very soon. Bye-bye, guys.